Today is July 1st, 2020. This is the Data Protection Workgroup meeting. Today we have two things on the agenda. First, we have, I think Tom will be talking about the execution hook and container notifier proposal comparison based on some of their experience. And then I will give an update of the working group review. We had a review meeting last Friday, so just briefly go through that. So let me give you permission to share your screen, Tom. Okay. Can you give it a try?
Yeah, looks like it works.
Okay.
Does that look good?
Yeah, I can see it.
Cool, thanks, Jing. I think so the background of what I wanted to discuss was we were looking at both the execution hook KEP that merged some time ago, as well as the recent container notifier proposals. And what we wanted to do was share some thoughts on, just our experiences based on customer use cases we've seen and kind of compare the two approaches. When we started looking at this, my kind of gut reaction was that I preferred the execution hook, but I think there's a lot more nuance there, which we can kind of dig into a little bit. So we've put together this document that kind of outlines some of our thoughts. I linked it inside the main meeting doc as well, so you should be able to access it from here. From a high level, I think the two approaches are trying to achieve some of the same goals, right? Essentially, we need to be able to quiesce state before taking a snapshot. A lot of experience we have with Canister is kind of included in this document. Typically, we quiesce at the application level. Part of that is actually because we don't have real hooks that we can actually quiesce at the file system level, right? We can't guarantee that we are running a privileged container, for example, to be able to run the FS freeze, unfreeze, etc. So feel free to ask questions, interrupt. I don't want to.
Hey, Tom, are you saying you never do FS freeze?
We typically don't.
Okay.
Most of what Canister does is usually through, I think where it has more traction is using application level things like, flush tables with read lock, fsync, the Mongo commands, fs sync, I think.
Okay.
So kind of going through the application level.
And then that's enough for other use cases that you run into. I thought some certain cases that they require or at least prefer to have FS freeze run before
that. I think we do prefer that. There's no hook right now that we can really use for that.
Okay.
That's consistent.
So maybe that's I think is it Nolan or Ashish? I think Laura uses some of those hooks
in Valero
to do FS freeze. Yeah. Okay, but we can maybe talk about that later.
Yeah, I think it's a good discussion because typically what we see is we can't guarantee that we can run in a privileged container.
Okay. So that's the reason. But if a user can build that type of a privileged container, then your existing framework should allow that to happen, right? Because you do have a way to run those commands.
It does indeed, yeah. We have the hook to essentially run kube exec.
Right.
Pedal exec, which would allow that, right?
Okay, yeah. Okay, sure.
Yeah, no, but that's a great question. And I think the thing that I really like about the container notifier proposal is this would really kind of guarantee you have that privileged access to run that FS freeze unfreeze, but of course it comes with all the caveats of having that access.
Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to go through a quick discussion of the things that I really liked about the execution hook KEP. And so, essentially giving reasons why. My hope is that the KP is not forgotten or dead. And so we can talk about that in discussion. I'll go through some customer use cases that we've seen kind of in the field. And they're obviously targeted more towards like the canister model, but I think a lot of them would apply here as well. The big kind of difference is that we get this extra level of indirection by having a CR in the execution hook KP. By the way, most people are familiar with the execution hook KP versus the container notifier, right? I think we've been discussing container notifier in the past few meetings here as well, right? Are there any questions I can dig into on the differences between the two? I think from a high level, the execution hook KP has a separate CR that you define that defines what the action you're performing. And so you have an object that exists in the cluster that you can modify. The container notifier proposal is adding the command directly to the pod or workload itself. And so if you want to do an update to that, you have to modify that pod spec itself. Right? And so
hey, Tom, I have a quick question. So are we, the last I knew was we were favoring the container notifier over the execution hooks. Is that not the case anymore?
When I say we, I'm actually talking about kind of Caston's thoughts. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because I wanted to start a discussion to, essentially give our thoughts on the execution hook proposal, based on the fact that I think a lot of the discussion in this group has been leaning towards the container notifier proposal, right?
Okay.
So we kind of hold a contrarian position, I would say, in some sense.
Okay.
Yeah. And sadly, Webov is not here as well, but he can jump in. But I think Carl is on the call. I think from our experience with Canister, we like the level of indirection that the execution hook provides. There's a bunch of use cases that kind of opens up. There is a concern around security, which we can talk about, which I think was one of the big motivators for the container notifier proposal, which we should definitely discuss. For us, though, what we've seen with Canister is that having a separate CR that defines the action actually gives you pretty fine-grained control over authorization. So you can have RBAC on the object itself, right? Maybe the controller that you define to implement the hook is only in some namespace, and so maybe only certain users can create that object in that namespace. And so you can kind of authorize or deauthorize access to creating that on a per user basis, right? And we see that's something that Canister does as well. And we see that kind of all over the place with our customers, right? There's typically kind of admins in clusters with maybe many developers, and the developers should not have access to run these hooks in some cases. There's obviously many different kind of patterns you can set up, but that one is pretty common. So we also found that people don't like modifying their application directly. Usually what happens is we see people deploy kind of an upstream version of like a database, so using like a Helm chart. And then they want to be able to integrate it with their infrastructure in some custom way. So whether they're using different types of storage providers, whether they want to do things like use logical dumps of the database instead of actually using volume snapshots. We typically find that pretty much for all of our customers, there's some level of customization required. And if the implementation of the hook is defined, let's say by the Helm chart author, I think it would have to be modified by the developer themselves. And for us, what we've seen is that it's much easier to have a separate CR that can be is more easily customized, right? Would the Helm chart author, for example, need to provide hooks? Have values that would specifically modify this annotation? I think that would be feasible, but it would probably be cumbersome to use and get developed correctly. Whereas what we've done for Canister is we've actually we have several of these kind of CRs that define the workflows for backing up applications. Some that use quiesce and unquiesce, and some that use logical backups. You could, for example, have a difference between using a volume quiesce and an application level quiesce as well.
So it basically means that they don't want to change their pod definition frequently, right? Once it's deployed, they don't want to change that. But if it's a CR, then they can have their pod definition, they can have the pod not changed, but just change this CR that has the hook definition.
That's right. Yeah. We usually see that the question is who's modifying it. And usually we see developers kind of deploying what they need. But then you kind of have like a backup admin or cluster admin that would go and define the integration with their infrastructure that tells you how to go and back things up. And with Canister, maybe you can still give permissions to let the developer take backups. In fact, that's pretty common, but you don't necessarily need to, right? You can kind of separate that out.
And the other aspect is if people are running Helm charts, like they would be hesitant to update the pod spec just to add these hooks because that may not behave very well with their application.
Okay.
Yeah, we've definitely, and that's a great point. We've, I strongly agree with that point. We've initially, when we started writing Canister, we actually took upstream Helm charts and modified them to include even just the blueprint CRs, the CRs that define the hooks inside the Helm charts themselves. We found a few things. We found that it was a big pain to maintain, right? Kind of consuming and rebasing on top of upstream was always a non-trivial effort. Even though we built some automation around it, it still took some time. And customers did not actually want to deploy these modified Helm charts, right? They wanted to use something more vanilla upstream and then kind of have these added on top, these hooks added on top of it. Yeah. There's a few other kind of points too that I think just some of the thoughts we put down. So we believe that it's a little bit more difficult to modify core pod APIs to include new fields or essentially annotations, which the guidance we've been given is kind of that it's similar to modifying core fields. I think the snapshot controller is a good example here. By having everything defined as CRDs, it was easier to iterate and improve upon, whereas there's a higher, I think it's harder to act independently of the other SIGs to move forward on core pod API changes. I think it's just, it's not a huge concern, right? I think we should probably we shouldn't necessarily let the timeline influence the architecture too heavily, but I do think it is at least a point worth mentioning that it does take longer to first get things even into these core APIs, as well as iterate on them as well, right? And if the snapshot controller is a lesson, I think lesson there is that it's really useful to be able to iterate quickly and kind of add new support on there as well. I do think the hooks here are a simpler API compared to the snapshots, but it's still useful to have to be able to iterate on them quickly. The other kind of minor point is there's a lot of configuration that I think you need to be able to run these hooks. So what we found with Canister is people want to run them in different places with access to different secrets and config maps and things. You are potentially limited. It's easier to specify additional configuration if you have a separate API object. And obviously you can continue to add more and more fields to the annotations, but I think that's that it's just it's more difficult basically. Right? And so I had some discussion on what we've seen with customers, and I can dig into those a little bit. I think really for both proposals, what we've seen is that these are kind of a primitive that we need. Like typically to really back up an application, you need both the quiesce, unquiesce commands, as well as obviously snapshotting, but potentially other stages as well. For example, for more advanced use cases, maybe you want to discover some information about the app you're backing up, figure out what's a secondary, execute specific database commands, for example, freeze replication, etc. Scale down pods, scale up pods, those kind of things. I think what we should focus on for either proposal is choosing the primitives that we need to add things, right? So one thing we mentioned earlier was it'd be great if we could have a primitive that would call the quiesce unquiesce, the volume quiesce unquiesce. Yeah, so I think, in either case, like we wouldn't be able to walk out of this with everything we would need to be able to take backups, but I think that's why we've had discussions around the higher level backup controller.
Tom, so you mentioned the migration. You mean that's like part of the, before you do backup, you need to do that, or why is migration mentioned here?
Migration, I think I mentioned that below, right? That was here, right?
Right.
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of different use cases for backup.
Are you talking about different? Are you talking about different use case, not the backup, or are you still talking about backup here? When you say one size does not fit all, because we are trying to, when we do content notifier, we are trying to make it more, a general approach. You can kind of send signals to the pod. So is that what you're trying to describe, a different use case, or I'm not getting what you mean here?
No, I didn't make that clear, and I think you're right. I did sneak another use case in here. I'll just give you a quick overview of kind of the background of what I mean by migration. When we talk to our customers, we actually see different use cases for backup and restore. There's you can do like in cluster, even within the same namespace, backup and restore. Mm-hmm. You can do like cross namespace backup restore. You can do between different clusters for more of a DR use case. Mm-hmm. You can also do backup and restore for updating versions of your Kubernetes cluster. So for example, we have a lot of customers who've come in with asking for help with their OpenShift 3.x to 4.x migrations, right? Because you can't do an in-place cluster upgrade. Mm-hmm. So when I say migration there, I'm actually talking about the far end of that use case, right? Where you're actually migrating between different clusters that maybe have different versions. And what we found for those type of upgrades is that customers actually prefer different workflows. So, the most recent one I worked with wanted to kind of scale down every application, copy the data over, which, is kind of like the way that they would actually quiesce the volumes, right, by doing the scale down and unmounting the volumes, and then migrate at that point. Mm-hmm. And my point here is just that there's actually a lot of different ways you can do backup and restore. Right. And so I think the focus of either proposal or both proposals should be kind of flexibility and looking at this as more of a primitive.
Right. But those probably does not just, because I think both proposals, we are talking about how to run a command inside the container, right? But mm-hmm. some of the steps are probably involve some other commands that's not necessarily running inside a container, some other type of commands that you need to run, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what you've done with both proposals is really good, where you're focusing on solving kind of, implementing a primitive, right? It's something that would be composed as part of a larger process to do even backup or migration or these other kind of use cases. And so here, I don't think this point actually is a pro or con for container notifier or the exec hook proposal. I think it's just saying that these would both act as primitives within more advanced processes, right?
Yeah.
And the other just kind of tidbit I can share is we typically see people wanting to modify these themselves. So I have an example in some docs that list a bunch of blueprints that we've open sourced. And what these are really kind of like a base for people to modify themselves, because what we've seen with every customer is that they really want to do some of their own custom integration. Whether it's how they consume configuration for their apps, if they've modified even their Helm charts themselves, you have to maybe modify the blueprints as well. Which I actually think that point does kind of lend towards the CR approach, because you can separate out the quiesce or backup approach from the application definition itself. I think I included this here just because I wanted to, I love to dig into kind of the problems with things. And so I'd love to dig into the problems with the security concerns. I think they are definitely valid. The high level bit from my understanding is basically that it's, we don't want to give permission to a controller to exec into any pod, right? I have one controller running in a namespace, which we're maybe initially asking people to deploy themselves. I think it's a pretty broad permission to be able to exec into anything, right? That essentially gives you permission for, almost everything except for maybe some, app lifecycle things, right? But you can get every secret, you can get every, it's very, very broad.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else you want to add there, Jing? I know that, I don't want to minimize the issues with that. I think they're definitely.
Yeah, that's the main concern, is the security concern. Because, so this is the concern from the API reviewer, and there was also like SIG-Auth, they would have concerns about this as well. And also another thing is, so we would like to get more, like we have, this working group is the data protection working group. So I think the use cases that we have been focusing on are quiescing and unquiescing for taking a backup and snapshots. But it will be also good if we can find more use cases. But I think it's probably going to be tough since that's our focus. So I mean, right now, we still have not really decided on which way to go. So we are exploring the container notifier approach, but we did get pushback from Signode because they basically don't want to add anything complicated to the kubelet, right? So if we add this one, that's a lot of complicated code changes there. So that's the thing. So I think for this to move forward, we need to have some very strong use cases to convince them that this is really something that we have to do this way. I think it's difficult. I mean, there are pros cons from either side, basically, no matter which approach we use. So I would say that, yeah, we have not really made the decision on which way to go yet, but we will continue to explore the container notifier approach because, well, the execution hook one, since we already get a cap that is merged, right? So this is the container notifier, it's this another proposal that we just want to see whether we can persuade the signal to accept this, or otherwise, what is the other way? Because there are only two. I don't really see middle ground here. Yeah, so I think it's very, very important to get feedback from you guys, the backup restore vendors. So at least we want to know what are the pros cons from your point of view.
So question for Tom, and this is a 101 style question. So just pretend that Carl asked it instead of me.
Sure.
If we did the container notifier, would we be able to, even with slightly unnatural acts, be able to get more of those app consistent backups, or is it pretty much you're going to get what we would consider sort of storage consistent backups, but wouldn't be able to get up into, you know, sort of MySQL or Mongo or that level?
That's actually a really good question. And I think what you're asking is, are there different, should we consider different approaches depending on the specific use case we want to add? So is application quiescing different than volume quiescing? I think that's a really good insight. You know, I think that one world maybe, for example, that we can solve like the application quiescing use case separately from the volume quiescing use case. You know, I think what I would love is actually the ability to have an API that is standardized for volume quiescing. And I honestly think actually the container notifier is a great proposal for that. And so it may not be an either or, you know, maybe a false comparison. I do feel that the execution hook is potentially a better model for application quiescing, kind of for the reasons I mentioned earlier, right? The level of indirection I think provides a lot of value for this level, and you don't need the escalated privileges you need for the volume quiescing and you know, the kind of more stricter reviews and design process you need for implementing container notifier. Right. So I do definitely believe there's a world where both these things exist for separate use cases, and I think that's great, right? These are both kind of primitives.
That was what I walked away with, because I mean I draw the parallel to NetApp had SnapDrive and Snap Manager, and SnapDrive basically did what the container notifier does, which is sort of the storage level quiescing, and then Snap Manager actually did the app integration. And some customers wanted one, some customers wanted both, but they were different beasts. So, Xing, I get your point that getting one approved is hard, getting two approved is probably harder.
Oh no, I don't think we need both though. Actually don't get what you say, because I think with either of those, we should be able to do both. I mean, yeah, it's not that straightforward, but if we have a way to run a command in the container, I think then we should be able to do that for both application quiesce and also volume quiesce. I'm not sure what exactly you're talking about, that you said the NetApp has this approach that it's more like container notifier. I wouldn't expect they change the port definition directly. The entry.
Sorry, this was a 2000s reference because I'm old now. But when we added support for SAN, what we did is we had a SnapDrive which knew how to quiesce the LUN, and then we had a Snap Manager that knew how to quiesce Oracle or SQL or something like that, and the two would work in combination. So the Snap Manager would trigger a SnapDrive, but we had some customers who just said, no, I just want the SnapDrive. I just need basically a storage consistent snapshot, but they weren't necessarily worried about all the application. Because again, you do a database backup and it's log truncation and it's all the extra bits and bobs that you want to manage. And so we split them up into two separate products. But again, this is before VMs were, people weren't even thinking of VMs back then. So I don't want to draw the analogy too strong.
Okay. That's you're probably talking about consistency groups, I'm guessing.
Consistency groups came later and we did a terrible job at those, but it just comes down to, again, when you think about it, if I quiesce, if I get a sort of a storage consistent version of the data, that's good, but I do need an application hook to tell the application that it needs to go into, say, backup mode, so it flushes its logs, so that then when I do the storage consistent, it flushes that out. Again, at the application level, I may want to say, again, now that I've done this backup, I can truncate the log, free up space so that the log doesn't grow. So there are things that even if you get sort of a storage consistent backup, that doesn't necessarily solve the application level problem directly. It helps it. Which is, I think, where Tom was going, but it doesn't give me actual application backup.
Okay, I was thinking I would think they wouldn't need another separate API in order to do that. They can just do that quiesce before they take a snapshot inside their storage. I mean, I'm just saying, I don't think they need a separate API from Kubernetes level. That's I'm guessing, but of course I don't think that I don't know the whole story. So
as a backup app though, I need some way to I need some way to trigger that application quiesce API though, right? I mean, the customer's
That's
not doing
application, yes, but you're talking about the storage level, or you're saying that when you're trying to take an application snapshot, but you want to trigger that.
Bingo.
At the
Right.
storage.
So, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I
So my
see.
first step is quiesce app. Then my second step is take storage consistent snapshot because I need the app to flush its buffers before. Am I kind of where you were going, Tom, or have I gone off into crazy land?
No, that's exactly what I think. Yeah, I think it's a great point.
Yeah. So that's similar to like performing FS freeze or FS sync before taking a snapshot of the volume. Tom, and I had another quick point about this follow-ups that you had. First of all, thanks for putting the comparisons out between the two proposals. And I have a feeling that we probably might need both proposals, and here's why. The issue with the execution hook proposal was the implementation or the security aspect of it. However, if that we can alleviate by using the container notifier proposal, and instead of the user having to update the pod spec, we can have the execution hook controller update the pod spec to add the commands, and the kubelet runs it. And that way, the execution hook no longer has to run commands in the pod.
No,
So
then I think then that we are still having the same problem if you do that. Because
I don't think so, right?
Because we don't want an external controller to modify the pod definition directly, right? So we are not going to modify the pod definition. The only thing that you can is maybe status is possible, but definitely not the definition itself.
Yeah, if you're able to take let's say you have multiple CRs that define different hooks, every time you run a hook, I don't think you want to update the pod spec, right?
Yeah.
I see your point though, right? I mean, these two approaches are not mutually exclusive, and it could be very well that you can invoke one, you could invoke the container notifier hook through the execution hook. Right?
Yeah. So I was trying to solve the security related issue with the execution hook, but yeah.
Yeah, well, the thing is, if you are using external controller to run that hook, then we're going back to the same thing, right? You're using the exact pod sub-resource. That's the same thing that we're trying to avoid. So,
so with the proposal that I just made, the execution hook controller will not have privileges to run commands inside containers. It will only have privileges to update the pod spec with adding the container notifier. And the container notifier and the kubelet was still responsible for running the command inside the container.
Right, but then we are not really, I don't think we are addressing any of the issues, because then I use basically that means we'll still need a container notifier, right? Complete.
Yes.
But then we are adding another thing that is an external controller that is modified. Well, but I think that's the concern here is actually not that you're basically trying to have like automatic way to define the pod or something. It's almost like you were trying to do that. So because the concern for container notifier is because we're trying to add too many things in it, and then Signode, they are having concerns,
yeah.
right? So with this, with what you just
container
said, it's not. But with what you have said, I think we still need to make all the changes in kubelet, right? I don't see.
Yes.
So okay, so then you are talking about adding another controller, which is writing up those pod specs.
Yeah, so with the container notifier proposal alone, the user will have to go update the pod spec to have the container notifier to do its thing. But with what I was saying is the execution hook controller would, instead of running the commands inside the container, would update the pod spec to add the container notifier block. And the
Okay.
kubelet is still responsible for running the commands.
So does that address the, I think, Tom, you talked about like users don't want to change the pod spec or Helm chart. Will this solve that problem?
I think so let me propose an alternate, because I think there is still an issue, a security issue with the execution controller itself that doesn't solve. If you want to go down the approach of having the execution hook controller, invoke things through the container notifier, I would actually separate out modifying the pod from the actual execution path itself. So for example, there's already a mechanism, right, of mutating webhook, which can update pods if you want, and then you can have whatever permissions you want in there, which would be give you kind of a higher granularity ability to set and unset permissions. And so you could have, for example, a supercluster admin that can define a set of container notifier additions, have the mutating webhook controller go and add those to the apps that it selects, and then limit the surface area of what the execution hook controller can do by only invoking container notifiers on the smaller subset of apps, right? It can't actually go and modify it, because then anyone themselves can in fact run the execution hook controller, and you kind of sidestep the issue with the broad permissions for the execution hook controller. Would that make sense, Ashish?
So you're saying a super admin would create a set of container notifiers that anybody can add to their pods, and the execution hook controller would add those container notifiers to certain pods. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, exactly. Because there's really
Okay.
the two security issues I think on the table. One is the really broad granularity permissions of the execution hook controller, which I think we kind of agree is too broad. And the other problem is the pushback from Signode on the container notifier. I think Jing is pointing out the security concern pushback from Signode. I think what you're proposing is addressing the granularity permissions on the execution hook controller, right?
Yep. So I think just limiting the number of or the kinds of container notifiers that the execution hook can add would definitely, yeah, that would address that.
So there is a one thing in the container notifier that we're saying that we want to have some like well-defined notifier names, just like, for example, like CPU, those are reserved word, right, RAM or things like that. So if we have a few like maybe quiet, and then there are others are customized, but I don't know if that would be enough, because it seems like we have so many different use cases just for QoS, and then each one is different. So if we have those well-known names, I don't know if that would help at all, because I think that's one thing I'm thinking Signode would be interested in. If we say, oh, we only need to, let's say, we only need to support the 3 kind of notifier. One is called QoS, the other one is called I don't know, like maybe a shutdown or something, right? So I'm just coming up with something. But then for QoS, there are so many different definitions.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm like, I don't think that's possible. But that's exactly adding I mean, because their concern is, how do you know if a certain command is even successful? How do you guarantee that? That's why we added that probe thing, right? But then it just varies so much. So
yeah, if the container notifier proposal doesn't fly, then I'm not sure where.
If it's a well-known,
else?
So it's a custom. So we do have a customized. You can have a customized notifier. I was just saying that if just ideally, if it's possible for us to say, okay, I just have this 1 or 3, three QoS thing, then you can have like well-known names, and then will be easier to persuade them probably. But I don't think so. There's just so many different ways. So, and then because there are different ways, then it's hard for you to say, okay, it is really successful or not, right? So that's the problem, I think.
You know, Shane, I think that's a pretty good point. If for example, like we had the ability of, you know, putting my captain hat on, if we had the ability right now to execute FS freeze unfreeze and that alone, that would actually unblock a lot of use cases here. And you can manage that API specifically rather than making kind of a general purpose one of any type of 3S.
I would think you should be able to do that. I mean, so Ashish, can you comment on that? Because I know that you guys have a hook to do that, right? So, I mean, I don't know why Tom is thinking that's not possible, because you can already run command inside the container, right, Tom?
Yeah, so that
go ahead.
Yeah, for Valero, the hooks that we have runs as the user that is running the container or running the pod, and it just runs commands inside that container. So you're able to specify what command that you want to run and what container you want the command to be run in.
So it could be a little tricky if you have a lot of volumes, because for each one you need to run this, and then you need to know the exact path, right? So I think could become a little tricky, but it is possible. So Tom, I'm not sure your concern is just it's difficult to make this a precise command, or because I think it should be possible if you can already run the exact anyway, right, for your other things.
Yeah.
If you know what pod and what volume, the path, then you can run that, I think.
Yeah, we can certainly run it. The issue is privileges, right? If you have a security context,
I see.
we're unable to run FS freeze.
So so Ashish, how do you guys address that privilege issue?
So that is the user running the container has to be, yeah.
Okay, so it's like a special, okay, so you do have to have like a special pod, okay. Yeah, so we did actually, I think Ben is not here. No, we actually talked about there's another way, which is to do this in the CSI, have some basically it's like a part of your node plugin to run this. Yeah, but I tried that. I just think this is, you can really get into really bad situation if you don't do this right.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, because you could freeze the whole thing, right? Because I was trying that, I screwed up my setup because of that. So I think I really feel hesitant of adding this as a CSI command. We did talk about this one some time ago, actually. So that was like one thing that, since your node plugin, you know, that pod is already has privilege, it already doing a lot of things, like it has to do mount and all of that, right? So we should be able to do this. But I just think it's very dangerous. I think we're going to get all the support calls if we have that thing there. That's, yeah.
I remember there's some discussion on adding kind of safety hooks. I think if Dave's on the call, I think he was talking about that. Where
which hook? Safety hook?
Safety parameters. So for example, having like timeouts where you can only freeze for a limited amount of time.
Right. Yes.
Those kind of things.
Yeah. So those we do have. Yeah. So there's a timeout for that. Yeah. But the problem is, once you run those commands, if it's really frozen, there's no way for you to unfreeze it, right? So like FS freeze, if you you screw up, you know, you run that on the root, then it, you know, it frees your whole VM, and you know, there's really no way back. You just have to reboot, right? So there are things like that. Yeah. So there are things like that. You just need to be very, very careful with that command. It's very powerful. So you just need to do it right, basically. I mean, otherwise.
It sounds like we do need the, so coming back to the follow-up items, to make progress on this, I think we need the container notifier proposal to be accepted, and maybe we should figure out how do we get that to,
you know,
how do we get that approved?
Just to dig into, I think that's a good comment, right? You know, we definitely want to make forward progress. And I think having kubelet support here would definitely help, partially because it is actually harder to get things in. So this will be a dangerous command, and it'll be more dangerous. You know, if something's very dangerous, right, you want to make it very, very safe. The thing that Jing was saying, I want to dig into a little bit. If we're worried about FS freeze and unfreeze being too broad, right? Mm-hmm. It seems that we need a specific mechanism which has all the safety parameters around it, rather than making a general mechanism that can run FS freeze, unfreeze, as well as many other things, right? Because the general mechanism wouldn't allow you to build in these like very specific safety measures.
Maybe, but so what I was trying to do was actually, I think if you make it very special, like, okay, you do it like a CSI method, then that'll be very special. But I think that actually will be dangerous that way, because it's like it's always running, because I don't think that this is required for all the use cases. Because I know people who are doing backup and restore, they don't really run this. They think they just run a sync. They don't really run the FS freeze.
That's true.
But I do see there are some people saying they do have to run this. Maybe EBS, they have some requirements saying you should run this, right? But not everybody. So I'm not sure. So maybe that's actually should come from you guys, the backup restore vendors. Is there something, how important is this particular command, right? So right now, I think most time we're talking about application requests, but this FS freeze, really how important it is. Because I'm not sure if it's really required. Because I know people don't use this at all.
I'll give a bit of a context there, Xing, if that helps.
Mm-hmm.
It's a necessary evil, I will put it that way. Mm-hmm. The reason being, when we look at some of the aspects that Tom presented from a canister standpoint, application specific, these are, cloud-born and the famous top DB workloads like, MySQL, Postgre, Cassandra, Mongos, etc. But there are world out there where there are legacy application, lift and shift, or, bring your own multiple database vendors, etc., where you need to have an ability to perform a volume level snapshotting, even for backup and restore. At the same time, when we do a volume level snapshotting, you want to involve the application in some way. We do, when I say application here, the container which is running the application here, just not the DB alone, right? That way I'm putting it. What we do is we try and do it in twofold. One is have a kind of a pre-post hook before and after snapshotting kind of, where they can register and run their own application specific APIs, scripts, PowerShells, whatnot, bash scripts, whatnot, right? The other one is we do a file system consistency, at least if the application fails. And to achieve that file system consistency and IO pausing, we do a FS freeze.
Okay.
You can draw an analogy even in the virtual machine world. In the virtual machines, if you run a Linux VM on cloud, and if you want a cloud backup solution for your virtual machine workload, you do a pre-post script kind of a framework where they can optionally register those, or they can skip that and at least have a FS freeze and thaw being done. And during that time frame, you do a volume snapshotting, right? Where I'm going to is, if you only have to support the top 5 workloads like MySQL, Cassandra, Mongo, etc., you can do a DB level backup script. That's where you don't do a volume snapshotting there. What you do there is basically take the MDF file or a DBback file, which is provided by respective backup engines. But backup engines are not the only number of use cases that are out there. When we look at run any container on Kubernetes kind of a view.
Yeah, great point. Not all applications are crash consistent, and so you still need storage support. We've even found with like databases that we still use volume snapshots because often the storage provider is much more efficient, right? They implement their own very efficient change block tracking, for example.
Correct.
Yeah,
Some of the
That's how we always did VMware too, right? The entire VMware is quiesce take snapshot, unquiesce app, so that you've got the app in hot packet mode for the minimum amount of time possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other direction I see from backup vendors and also the customers of backup vendors, how they are influencing is gone are the days where the DB size used to be in GBs and maybe reaching TBs. I can see applications where the databases are in multiple terabytes. A typical example could be SAP HANA. HANA DBs are in multiple TBs, and their stream-based backup solution, traditional backup solution, will not work. And where they are tending towards is do a IO pause using Bettis Freeze and similar technology, and do a disk level snapshotting, and bring back, reattach the disk, and make the HANA understand it. Because with the large DB, you cannot just do a stream level backup solution. Sometimes that will not work at all. It will take hours.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I understand that what you need to take one snapshot, but I do know some certain backup vendors, they don't run Bettis Freeze, but they do a sync. Basically, it's a flush the buffer, and then take a snapshot. So so probably there are, yeah.
No, I was saying, Shing, you have another agenda item and we have 4 minutes left. So
Okay. Yeah. So that's fine. So hey, thanks, Tom.
Yeah, thank you.
So how do we, before we go to the other agenda item, how do we proceed on this? Because it was a good discussion, but
yeah.
Good point.
So yeah, so I actually we will need to get some feedback from Signode on this, because otherwise it means
So I'm going to add a couple of notes that I took to this document here.
Yeah, sure,
Tom.
sure.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Yes, please. Yeah, add notes there.
Is there anything we can give you, Shing, for preparing for the SIG discussion, or
so if that's actually that's why we asked Tom to to look at this. What would be helpful is to like have more use cases to say that, okay, this is really important. We really need this in kubelet. So I think we talked about some of those today, but if you have anything else, please maybe add to this doc. I think that's helpful. Yeah, I think it's it is pretty tough to get anything in kubelet. They usually does not want to add anything.
Totally understand.
New.
But if we can get you more ammunition, we'll do our best.
Thank you. So, okay, let me go back to. Right, so we only have 2 minutes. I just want to give an update. So last Friday, I arranged another meeting, a separate meeting, to review the volume group cap, because I don't want to use our data protection group meeting time for entirely just for that. I have the link there, the cap. The main thing that we discussed the other day is what is the right way to create a volume group. Because there are different vendors, they support different things. So we decided that we don't want to support immutable volume group, meaning that once a volume group is created, you should still be able to modify it, meaning adding new volumes to it or removing volumes from it. But we don't want to say once you created the volume group that becomes immutable, you cannot change the membership of the volumes anymore. So I'm supposed to send an email to the mailing list just to see if there's any people who have some strong use case that to support this. If we want to support both, it's very difficult. Then basically meaning that user have to have at least 2 different type of volume group classes to say one is mutable, the other is immutable, make the portability difficult. So yeah, so that's the main thing that we discussed in that meeting. Yeah, so if you have any comments about this, reach out to me, but otherwise I will need to send out a email about about this. Okay. That's all today. Anything else? All right. That's it for today. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Xing. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I had one quick thing before we all disperse. So as follow-up to help drive the container notifier step forward, I missed what you wanted from
so take a look
folks,
of the so I think so Tom has this document, right? If you have anything you think that can help us to say why you think container notifier is the right approach, what it can help us, or even if you have some other additional use cases that we can reference, please add. So anything that you think can help promote this case, because we are trying to persuade the signal that we really, really need this, right? So we want to say it is very important why we have so many use cases that require this. Yeah, so that's what we need.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.
Bye.